Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 93 of the Feeling Good podcast. David and I today have decided to give ourselves a little challenge. David has quite a few techniques, and in fact, new ones come up, every week almost. But there's a list that he calls 50 Ways to Untwist Your Thinking. This is part of the ebook for those of you who have it. And if you don't have it, you can always order it from the website. There's an order form. But we decided to call this podcast episode 50 Methods in 50 Minutes.
Right. So we're going to start talking really, really fast so we can squeeze them all in.
Well, actually, we'll try to not give them short shrift. Anyhow, this might turn out into a couple episodes. But,
but it's a great idea, and it's one that you came up with, Fabrice. And to tell you the truth, way back when I first started doing workshops in conferences and stuff, I used to go over like 20 or 25 techniques really pretty quickly.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I thought a workshop was. And people really liked it. And so, I was, pleased when you came up with this idea. I think we'll have some fun with it. To learn a technique, you have to have an example of it and practice it. But, it doesn't hurt to just get an overview of the landscape, like a Google, map type of thing.
Yeah.
And see what all of these techniques are all about. A couple follow-ups first. Several weeks ago, Sarah Shane, one of the participants in our Tuesday training group at Stanford, kindly did a podcast with us on procrastination.
Yes.
And that was a very popular one, and you might recall that she was procrastinating about promoting her clinical practice and making brochures and things like that. And we'd given her an assignment the next morning to, only spend 5 minutes on it, and then call us with, at the end of those 5 minutes, with mission accomplished or I stubbornly refused. And that was a huge mission accomplished for Sarah. And she said once she did that 5 minutes worth, she really got into it and spent several hours on it and had a ball. And she says she's been on a high ever since. And I keep forgetting to give that feedback, but it was very gratifying. And then the next week, Werner Spitzboden, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Alicia Beal volunteered for part 2 on the feared fantasy. And Werner had insecure thoughts about starting out again in clinical practice after working in administration for many years. And Alicia had self-conscious thoughts about merging with the advanced group and then having people notice her turning red and blushing. And then she thought they'll be thinking I'm an idiot and I'm stupid and I'm incompetent because I blush. And the Feared Fantasy episode was one of my favorite podcasts, although we've had a lot of favorites. The live therapies have been favorites, but these were kind of like live therapy too. And they both hit the ball out of the park on that podcast. They've both been doing tremendous ever since. So they asked me to pass that good news on
that's great news,
to everyone. And then one last thing is that I think this is mid-June now when this one is being published.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in some tremendous training, I've got my 2 summer intensives coming up, 4-day intensives. And the one in July will be in Whistler, Canada, sponsored by Jack Hiroshi and Associates. That's July 3 to July 6. So I guess I'll be gone on the 4th of July. Yes, 2018. And so you can find the links to these on my website, feelinggood.com, and the workshop page. But that'll be a beautiful one up in a great resort area, Whistler. And then in August, we have the one here at the South San Francisco Conference Center, my 4-day intensive from August 6th to 9th, 2018. And these two intensives are generally my best workshops of the year. In San Francisco, we'll have a lot of people from my Tuesday group there, all 4 days, helping out with the small group exercises. So you get a lot of hands-on training and individualized feedback from me and my colleagues. Mike Christensen is going to join me up in Whistler, Canada for the Canadian intensive. He's fantastic. He'll be my co-therapist for a live demo up there. Jill Levitt will be my co-therapist for a live demonstration at the San Francisco one. And they should be tremendous experiences. So with no further ado, should we just dive in?
Yeah, so we have in front of us the list of these 50 techniques. And how about I call them out when we're ready to start for each one? So number one is, of course, empathy.
Right. And this is one of 4 basic techniques. And empathy just means that before you can do anything clinically, you have to form a warm, compassionate relationship with your client. You can use the 5 secrets of effective communication to do that. We do tremendous training on that in my Tuesday group, and it's really an important key to clinical work with any patient. Empathy alone won't cure anyone of much of anything, but we're going to use powerful techniques, and unless you have that trust and warmth and acceptance, you won't be effective with powerful techniques.
Yeah, that's been my experience. Okay, good. So next is number 2, agenda setting.
Yeah, this is the most important thing in all of psychotherapy. It's a complex topic that we could spend, 7 podcasts on. We'd still be scratching the surface. But essentially, once you've empathized with a client.
And by the way, you will be emphasizing this in your next book.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's for sure. Yeah. And I sent to Fabrice a draft of it just the other day so we can bring you a tremendous podcast on, does the self exist? And can the self be judged?
Yeah, we're going to do that.
Yeah, we'll do that soon. One of the themes of the book. But yes, agenda setting, you find out what, if anything, the patient wants help with. Then you get a specific moment when that was happening, because you can't treat them for self-esteem or depression. Those are vague concepts. I'd want to know, what's the specific time of day that you had low self-esteem? Where were you? What was going on? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? Who were you interacting with? And then once you have a specific moment the patient wants help, you melt away the patient's resistance to change using a wide variety of newly developed techniques.
Yeah, in fact, saying that agenda setting is one technique is really not really giving it its due. There's so many techniques that are part of that.
And I would add that all therapists believe they can do agenda setting, and they're all wrong. They all say, it's fine.
You mean I'm wrong too?
Yes, the goals of therapy, and it's vastly beyond finding the patient's goals for therapy. It's really bringing the patient's conscious resistance to conscious awareness and then melting it away quickly.
Mm-hmm. So number 3 is identify the distortions.
Well, this is probably the most famous of all cognitive therapy techniques. In my book, Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy, I created the list of 10 distortions that I had created and was using with my patients. Some of them came from Albert Ellis, the grandfather of cognitive therapy. Some of them came from Aaron Beck, the father of cognitive therapy. Some came from Karen Horney. Some were ones I named and kind of created myself. But it's the all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, self-blame, should statements, mind reading, fortune telling. It's identifying the distortions in your negative thoughts, like I'm a loser, or I should be better than I am, or whatever are the thoughts that make you feel depressed or anxious or angry or whatever.
I actually counted them in the daily mood log, and there's actually 13, because some of them have several distortions within them.
That's right. That's right. One example would be should statements. You've got should statements directed against the self, should statements against others.
Yeah, and blame is self-blame or other blame.
Exactly.
And then jumping to conclusions is fortune-telling or mind-reading.
Exactly.
Then there's magnification and minimization. So,
right.
So there's a number of them.
Yeah. But I would say that my list of 10 cognitive distortions has probably been seen, I would guess, by at least 10 million people around the world. Yeah. It's been in, a zillion magazines, and it's very popular. People can really relate to that. And it's helpful to see that the thoughts that upset you are wrong thoughts. Depression and anxiety are the world's oldest cons.
So I know that I'm going to take more time than is required, but I had a thought that there's more than just those distortions in our thinking, isn't there?
Well, you mean the self-defeating beliefs?
Yeah, and
sure.
Like, for example, people sometimes have magical thinking. That would be a distortion.
Yeah, but I call that a self-defeating belief, or I should always try to be perfect, or my worth as a human being depends on my achievements, or I have to be loved to feel happy and fulfilled. And those are at a little deeper level of the psyche than the cognitive distortions. The cognitive distortions exist in the here and now when you're upset. The self-defeating beliefs set you up for the cognitive distortions. And it's the interaction between a self-defeating belief and a negative event that produces cognitive distortions, and that produces depression and anxiety. Just a quick example so they'll know what I'm talking about. Let's say you're basing your worth as a human being on your achievements. That's your belief system.
Yeah.
And as long as you're achieving or having a good podcast, you'll think, I'm worthwhile, I'm achieving, I'm a good person.
Yeah.
But you'll predictably get depressed or anxious when you fail or when you're in danger of failing, and then you'll think, I've failed, I'm worthless, I'm no good, and you'll have all these negative emotions.
Well, maybe we should, plan an episode on that interaction between the self-defeating belief and the distortions.
As well as how to change the self-defeating beliefs.
Well, of course, yes. So number 4 is the straightforward technique. We don't talk about this very much.
Well, I used to say that the straightforward technique is a great technique to try first with your patients, because it virtually always fails, and you can fail in 30 seconds and get it over with and move on to another technique. And the idea is fail as fast as you can. Have many techniques to challenge a negative thought. In the new era, this has changed radically, and the straightforward technique is dramatically helpful for almost everyone I work with now because of the new paradoxical agenda setting techniques, which makes the patient so easy to work with and so easy to change. But all the straightforward technique is, it's just saying to the patient, all these techniques have to do with negative thoughts on a daily mood log. You don't just throw these techniques at a patient. You've got to have an agenda and a moment when they're upset and they're writing down their negative thoughts. And then these are techniques they can use to crush their negative thoughts. And so the straightforward technique is you just say, let's take this thought. You're telling yourself that blah, blah, blah. Can you think of a way of talking back to that thought, a more realistic thought, a more positive thought? And then the patient will tell you what their positive thought is. And to be effective, the positive thought has to have 2 characteristics, although you've pointed out at a deeper philosophical level, maybe only 1 characteristic, but there's a necessary and sufficient condition for emotional change. And one is that the positive thought they come up with has to be 100% true, and it has to crush their belief in the negative thought. And often the patient's the positive thought they come up with to crush their negative thought won't really be true, so it doesn't help them, or it will be true, but it doesn't crush the negative thought. Just to make a simple example, let's say you have the negative thought, I'm a worthless human being. Well, I would say 80% of the depressed patients I've treated have had that thought. That's the essence, really, of depression, is feeling low self-esteem, feeling worthless. Now, let's say you take the positive thought, at least I can boil an egg. Now, is that thought true, Fabrice?
That's true.
So that has the necessary condition for emotional change. Now, what's the sufficient condition, Fabrice?
It has to crush the thought I'm a worthless human being.
And will the person's belief go down in that thought?
Well, barely.
Not at all. They'll say, I'm still worthless.
Yeah.
Even worthless people can boil an egg.
Yeah.
So that has the necessary but not sufficient condition for emotional change. So that's a very simple technique. But now, as I say, when we've worked with people, reduce their resistance using positive reframing, magic button, magic dial, all these cool new techniques, often they can crush their negative thoughts just with the straightforward technique.
All right. So now, beyond the basic techniques, next one is the double standard technique.
Right. And now these are in categories. And what category is this one?
This is listed under compassion-based techniques, which only has one technique under that category.
Yeah. You can put empathy under that category. You can also put the new paradoxical agenda-setting techniques under that category, too. Part of it is that these things can shift because sometimes they exist in many different categories. Yeah. But compassion, the double standard technique is based on the idea that most of us operate on a double standard. When we're depressed, and you who are listening to this, when you're down, having a moment of self-doubt, you probably rip yourself to shreds with self-critical thoughts. I shouldn't have screwed up. What's wrong with me? Blah, blah, blah. And if you were talking to a dear friend, you wouldn't, with this exact same problem, you wouldn't say all those mean things to them. You'd talk to them in a warm, kind, realistic way. And so the double standard technique is based on just making the decision to talk to yourself in the same compassionate and loving way you would talk to a dear friend. When I was in Philadelphia, we had a big cognitive therapy program. We had an inner city hospital, and we put thousands of people through this group cognitive therapy program. And there was a woman who was in one of my groups one day, and she had the thought that she was a bad mother and a worthless person and a weak human being because she'd been hospitalized for depression. And she was telling herself, I think I've abandoned my children and I'm a bad mother. And it was all just because she had to be hospitalized for depression. And the nurses who knew her said she's a very loving mother, a wonderful person. She's just very self-critical. So in the group, I said, would you talk to a dear friend the way you're talking to yourself? Would you turn to her now and say, oh, because you had to be hospitalized for depression, you're a bad mother, your children feel abandoned, you're weak, you shouldn't have allowed yourself to get depressed. She said, no, I'd never talk that way to a dear friend. And I said, well, what would you say? And she'd say, you're a very loving mother, and your husband is taking care of the kids, and it is not a matter of, being a strong person or being shameful. If you're depressed, you got hospitalized, you get some help, and you deserve all the support and love in the world. And I said, are those thoughts true? And she said, absolutely. I said, would you be willing to talk to yourself that way? And she said, oh, you mean I would have a right to do that? And I said, absolutely. Talk to yourself like that right now. And she did it, and her depression disappeared just in the snap of a finger.
Yeah. And the thing is that the dear friend is somebody who's like us.
Oh yeah. So an identical person.
If I say something to that friend that is true for the friend, it's obviously true for me too.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of twists on all of these techniques.
Yeah, of course.
But it's, no one technique works for everyone, but this is a very lovely technique. Now, if a person doesn't have a double standard, it won't work. Because some people hate themselves and hate others. Yeah. So you say, what would you say to a dear friend just like you? And she said, I'd probably tell them to commit suicide. Or something. Yes. The technique didn't work.
Okay, that one is not going to work, yes. So now we're moving on to the section on truth-based techniques. And number 6 here is examine the evidence.
Yeah, and there's four of these. Examine the evidence, experimental technique, survey technique, and reattribution. Now, there's 2 ways that scientists can test theories, and these were based on Beck's thinking that when you're depressed, you're like a scientist who has a wrong theory. You believe something about yourself or the world that just isn't true. And so scientists can examine evidence that's already at hand, like you can look up something on the internet or, go to the library, do research, and often there's facts out there that will prove or disprove a theory. And so let's say a patient has the thought, when you're depressed, the hopeless thought, I'll be depressed forever. I can't improve. Now, that thought is flagrantly distorted and false because human emotions can't not change. Our feelings are always fluctuating.
Yeah.
But when you're depressed, you get this bizarre delusion that you're going to be stuck in severe depression for the rest of your life. And there's tons of ways to attack that, and it's got to be corrected because hopelessness often leads to suicidal urges. But one thing, and this is kind of a Buddhist technique as well, is to notice that feelings are impermanent. Everything in the universe is impermanent. And if you think about your feelings from the moment you were born up to the current moment, they've been constantly fluctuating. They're going up and down. When you came out the birth canal, you were screaming and crying, and then your mother comforted you, and then you felt better. And so you probably felt worse 5,000 times. I mean, that's the nature of life. We go up and down all the time. But every time you felt worse, what happened?
Then you start feeling better afterwards.
Exactly. So that would be examine the evidence to see that what you're telling yourself is really not true.
Okay. So number 7 is the experimental technique.
That's where you do an actual experiment to test your belief. You're not doing library research or internet research, but you set up a kind of experiment. A psychologist I treated had a bridge phobia. She was afraid of driving across the bridge, and she had a lot of ideas about what would happen if she tried to cross the bridge while driving. And one was that the bridge might collapse.
Yeah.
And they'd all fall into some ravine or something and die. And the other is that her hands would get sweaty, so she couldn't control the steering wheel.
Yeah.
And these thoughts just terrified her. And so we had her do 2 experiments to test these thoughts. One, I told her to get a bucket of water and put it down next to her car, and then get in, put her hands in the water, and then see if she could turn the steering wheel. And she was shocked to discover that steering wheels are created so they won't be slippery, and she could easily turn the wheel. And then I had her to go out to the bridge that she thought was so fragile and kind of go out just to stand on it a little, which she wasn't too afraid, and then jump up and down and see if she could make it fall down. And she was surprised to learn that it was quite sturdy. There's a million ways to use experimental method. Another, really funny one is I've had so many patients in my office who have panic attacks, and they're afraid that, they could go crazy during a panic attack. That's one of the beliefs people have.
That happens, yeah.
Yeah, they had a mother who was in the mental hospital, and then they're thinking, I'm going to snap too at some point.
Yeah.
And so I just have them test that with a belief to try to make themselves go crazy in the office, so scream, roll around on the floor, shout out weird things, gyrate weirdly with your body, whatever. And they're always surprised to discover they can't make themselves go crazy no matter how hard they try. And that generally results in an instant cure, often years of panic disorder.
So those are good experiments to try. But there's other ways to find the truth. So number 8 here is the survey technique.
Yeah, this is a kind of experiment the scientists do. We had a beautiful, courageous woman in our summer intensive a couple years ago who got up to volunteer for the live session, as I do on the evening of day 1 of all of my intensives in San Francisco, so people can see this new team therapy working and how powerful it can be. And we worked with a woman named Karen, who will also be featured in my new book, who thought she was a bad mother because her daughter had been shot in the face 9 years earlier, and Karen was blaming herself quite unfairly, but blaming herself for this. And so she just did a fantastic live demonstration and blew all of her thoughts away. And then she had 3 thoughts remaining on her daily mood log that she still believed the therapist in the audience are judging me. They probably think I'm a bad mother, and they probably think, how can she treat...
Mind reading.
Yeah, mind reading, exactly. How can she treat other patients when she can't even help themselves. And so what kind of survey could she do to test those thoughts?
Ask those people, is this what you think?
Exactly. Now, do you think that frightened her or not?
Oh, that probably frightened her a lot.
And does that mean it's a good idea or a bad idea?
Of course. Anytime you feel anxious and afraid of something, the best thing to do is to face the fear.
Absolutely. So she asked the therapist, would any of you come up to the microphone and I can ask you what you think of me? And about 8 people rushed up to the microphone, and they all had tears flowing down their cheeks saying, Karen, you were my hero, my hero tonight. And it was just absolutely boggled her mind.
Yeah. So number 9 is reattribution. That's an interesting one that you use all the time but don't talk about very much. Can you say something about the reattribution?
This was one of the ones that one of Beck's original techniques, and I don't use it a great deal, but it can be helpful from time to time. It's for self-blame. When you're blaming yourself unfairly for bad things that have happened. And when you do reattribution, you make a list of all the other factors that could have contributed to that bad outcome, in addition or apart from this interpretation that it's all your fault and that you're no good. The simple thing we've talked about on a previous podcast was an extraordinarily shy young man who was afraid to flirt with the checker in the grocery store. He thought she was giving him the eye, and yet he was terrified and just looked at the counter and went out without talking to her, and then felt ashamed and like a loser. And one of his thoughts was, well, if I try to flirt with her or say hello to her and she doesn't respond, it means I'm a loser. And then we listed, 10 or 15 other interpretations of why she might not respond enthusiastically. And it was a tremendous relief to him.
Yes, absolutely.
Like she may be gay, maybe she's not allowed to flirt with customers, maybe
she's married.
Maybe he's not very good at flirting yet because he's just a beginner. Yeah. All kinds of possible reasons.
So now we're moving on to the logic-based techniques. Number 10 here is the Socratic method.
Yeah, that's where this was another one of Beck's techniques.
Yeah.
He was very good at it. Also, one of my early students, Sterling Morey from London, who now practices in London, is just wonderfully skillful with this technique.
I would say Sterling Morey is also one of your early teachers.
Oh, yeah. He was my first student and one of my best teachers.
Yes.
Absolutely. He taught me a great deal about tenderness and empathy and compassion. And it's not all techniques, but it's the relationship with the patient is so important. And he modeled that. But on one of my Sunday hikes, one of the Sunday hikers had gotten irritable with his sons because he and his wife were doing everything for them, taking them for wonderful vacations, sending them to costly private schools. And he felt that when it came time for them to help out around the house and do their chores, that they were kind of sloughing off. And so he had kind of shouted at them a couple of times. And then on the hike, he was telling himself, I'm a bad father.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to blame ourselves and label ourselves like this. But he was feeling really, really down. And so I used the Socratic technique and said, so do you sometimes interact with your son in ways that aren't so good? And he said, yeah, not very often. But he said, I sometimes do. And I said, so does that make you a bad father? And he said, oh, absolutely it does. And they say, oh, do you sometimes do positive things for your sons? And he said, oh, yeah, we send them in private schools. I spend all the time with them. I'm very loving. We do, take them to wonderful vacations. And I said, and so when you're doing good things for them, does that make you a good father? And he says, well, I guess so. So I said, oh, are you a good father and a bad father at the same time? And he got his enlightenment, and he was able to see that he'd been generalizing from, specifics
Exactly,
to his whole self.
So the Socratic method is really good for overgeneralization.
And labeling.
Yes.
But it could be good for fortune telling
Sure.
too. Yeah, like something's coming up and it's going to be so terrible. Sterling has a book out on cognitive therapy for cancer patients.
Yeah.
And he uses the Socratic method a lot in there because they're predicting, this procedure is going to be so awful, or this awful thing is going to happen, and kind of leads them to let go of some of their fears.
Yeah. So we've done 10 techniques so far, and we're at about 2.5 minutes per technique. But that's still pretty good. So
yeah, that's not too bad.
Moving on to number 11, thinking in shades of gray.
Yes. This is the antidote to all or nothing thinking.
Yeah.
And you look at things in shades of gray rather than, thinking things are all one way or the other. A patient recovered from depression and told himself, "This is fantastic. I'll be happy forever. All my problems are solved."
Yeah.
Now, that's positive all or nothing thinking.
Yeah.
He's going into the all.
That's right.
And that's very dangerous because you set yourself up for problems.
You do, yes.
And then several weeks later,
You're guaranteed the disappointment.
You're guaranteed disappointment. He argued with his wife. He went to bed in a grumpy mood, woke up depressed, and then he told himself, my recovery was just a fluke. I'm a worthless human being after all. The therapy didn't work. And then he went into a severe relapse because he went into the nothing of all or nothing thinking. There are fantastic things in the world, medical breakthroughs, acts of fabulous compassion, astrophysics developments that boggle the mind about the nature of the universe. And there's horrible things in the universe, despicable, horrendous things. But most things are somewhere in between. And all or nothing thinking just doesn't fit reality. And it also sets you up for a lot of pain. Yeah.
Now, moving on to the section on semantic techniques. This is about how we word things. So number 12 is the semantic method.
Yeah, and this is a very humble technique, but it does have its place, and it's actually pretty useful.
I don't know. You say it's a humble method, but I'm telling you, I have a lot of clients for whom this is really a source of enlightenment.
Oh, that's great. Well, I agree, and it is a source of enlightenment, and that's because when we're upset, we often upset ourselves with colorful, kind of mean-spirited, demanding language, like we say, I shouldn't have made that mistake, or I'm such a loser. I treated a school teacher with severe borderline personality disorder who was telling himself he was a defective human being. And that's, again, one of the distortions people get into when they're depressed. They think that they're defective, like a broken radio or something, radio tube, or there's some inherently horrible, unchangeable defect. And I tried 15 or 20 techniques with this guy that were not effective. I couldn't dislodge him from that idea that he was a defective human being. And then I suddenly dawned on me to ask him to do 2 cost-benefit analyses. One, make a list of the advantages and disadvantages of calling yourself a defective human being. How will it help you? How will it hurt you?
Which, by the way, this is another technique, cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, maybe when we come to that one, we'll refer back to this dialogue that we just had. Then I said, and when you're done with that, this is a homework assignment I gave him, make another list of the advantages and disadvantages of calling yourself a human being with defects.
Yeah.
Now, that's the semantic technique, subtle change in the language. So he brought...
Undo the labeling,
Huh?
Undo the labeling.
Yeah. Instead of labeling yourself, you focus on your behaviors. You have a lot of defects. And he came in to the next session and he said, "Doctor, since you gave me that homework assignment, nothing in my life has changed. I'm still a terrible school teacher. I still don't have relationships with women. I still have no interest. I'm still a very boring person. But when I think I'm a human being with defects, I realize I can work to improve my teaching skills. I can develop interests. I can begin to relate to women and learn how to relate to women. And to tell you the truth, Doctor, my depression has disappeared for the first time in my life. And then there were just tears going down his cheeks. He said, "This has blown my mind." That's the semantic method.
And one thing to point out is you go from something that's a should, or as I put it to my clients sometimes, a need or a must, as Albert Ellis would say. He used the term of masturbation.
Yeah, right.
And you go from that to preference.
Yeah, I would, instead of I shouldn't have made that mistake. It would be great if I hadn't made that mistake. And so you just stop using this word should or ought to.
Right. So number 13 is let's define terms.
This is a technique that has incredible philosophical interest and importance. It might not necessarily be real helpful to someone who's depressed, but it's incredibly interesting. And that's when let's say you label yourself as an inferior human being or a fool or a loser or a failure. A lot of depressed people, anxious people feel like that. You ask yourself, what's the definition of a fool or a loser or a failure? And you'll find out that any way you try to define these terms, you run into problems. Your definition will apply to all human beings, in which case it's nothing to be upset about, or it'll apply to no human beings, in which case it's nothing to be upset about, or it'll just be a nonsensical definition, in which case there's no reason to be upset about it, or it definitely won't apply to you. A simple example is, let's say you say I'm a failure, so then or you could do it for I'm hopeless or anything, but what's the definition of, quote, a failure?
Well, if you're asking me, I don't really have one, but I'll come up with one that a client might need. Well, somebody who is not able to keep his job.
Oh, I see. A failure. So would you mean that they failed at that job, or that they had failed at everything?
Well, they certainly failed at that job, yes.
So are you saying that all human beings who fail at some job or goal or task are failures?
Well, I don't know.
What percentage of human beings have failed at one or more things?
100%.
So are we all failures?
I guess we are.
So that's how it works. Or you could say a failure. Well, anyway, any way you define it, it just falls apart.
We could have another episode on the meaning of words.
That's true. But a lot of our suffering, even suicide, can come because we're using language in a way that we fool ourselves. There's human beings. We all win at some things. We all lose at some things, and most of us are pretty average.
So number 14 here is be specific.
This is a Buddhist technique that leads to enlightenment. It seems real humble, and we use it a lot in some of the role play techniques. But when you have the thought, I'm a failure, to stick with the last example, it just sounds like you're this horrible human being, and then you could say, well, what are some of the specific things that I have failed at? Like on one of the hikes, and this will also be in my new book. One of the hikers was thinking she was a bad mother and kind of a horrible human being, and then we did something called externalization of voices, and we can illustrate that technique right now, and also show how be specific works.
I mean, we're going to get down to it eventually. It's listed in here, and the role-playing techniques.
Exactly. But we can illustrate it right now. And one of the reasons that she was thinking she was a horrible human being is she's sometimes lazy. Now, this is a very perfectionistic, high-achieving really a neat lady. But you be, and her name's Heather. We'll use that because it's in the book. You be the negative Heather, and I'll be the positive, self-loving Heather, and I'll show you how be specific works, along with the acceptance paradox.
Yeah. So you're a lazy human being, Heather.
Oh, absolutely. I'm often quite lazy, and to tell you the truth, I love being lazy. Actually, we didn't do the technique right.
That's the paradoxical acceptance paradox.
That's the acceptance paradox. But also say, you're a terrible human being. You're a terrible human being. Well, I have many faults. Which ones have you noticed? Now say, well, you're lazy. Well, you're lazy, yeah. Yeah, well, sometimes I am. I've been trying to be a little lazier lately, actually, because, I'm kind of burned out as a mother and as a full-time career and family person. To tell you the truth, it's kind of nice being lazy sometimes. Uh-huh. So how did we define the term here? How are we specific? Sorry. Well, instead of saying I'm a terrible human being the way she was, you say, what specific flaws do I have? And then when you have a specific flaw, it's easy to accept it with a sense of kind of humor, a sense of inner peace. Right. Suffering only exists in the clouds of abstraction, where you're telling yourself, I'm a failure, I'm a terrible human being, I'm a bad father, I'm a bad teacher. I've often told myself, David, you're a bad teacher. And I said, well, what does that mean exactly? What are my specific flaws? I said, well, you've got these 4 specific flaws. Do you have some strengths? Well, I got quite a few strengths too. Can you accept the fact that you have these flaws and maybe make a plan to improve a little bit? Okay. On to quantitative techniques. Number 15 is self-monitoring. Self-monitoring was one of the first and probably least useful of all of the cognitive therapy techniques, but it actually, like all of them, it has its place, and you just count things over and over again. Like, let's say you have negative thoughts. You can count how many negative thoughts you have every day. You can wear a wrist counter like the ones golfers wear on their wrist to keep track of the score. They probably cost $8 or $10. And every time you have a negative thought, you click it, and then you let it go and continue with what you're doing. It's kind of like mindfulness meditation, where you let go of a negative thought rather than dwelling after on having noticed it. After having noticed it. But with self-monitoring, your life becomes your meditation. You're living your life, but if you have a negative thought, you click it. Yeah. I treated a medical student who broke up with his girlfriend, who was also in his class. And then she started dating another fellow in his class, and he started getting intensely jealous, and he kept having fantasies of imagining them having sex, and he was getting very anxious and angry and feeling inadequate. He kept having these fantasies all the time. And I told him to count them on a counter, and to agree to keep it up for at least 3 weeks, because generally the thoughts will go down in the 3rd week. Yeah. And just every time that he didn't have to fight with the fantasies, but every time he had these upsetting fantasies, he would just click it and then continue with what he was doing. And he was having 80 or 90 of these intrusive negative thoughts each day. And then suddenly in the 3rd week, they went from 80 to 60, and then 20, and then 4, and then 0. And then he didn't care at all about this issue. So it's a humble technique, but it can occasionally be very helpful to people. All right. So number 16, the worry breaks. Oh, yeah, worry breaks. Yeah, this is another quantitative technique. And again, these will be suitable for some people and not for other people. There's no cure-all, and we don't just throw techniques at people, but we're just trying to tell you what's available. Yeah. This is where sometimes you can schedule times every day to be upset, rather than fighting against your thoughts. You can schedule, say, 3 minutes once a day, or 1 minute every hour. And then you just dictate your negative thoughts into a tape recorder, and then at the end of the 60 seconds or 3 minutes, you stop and carry on with whatever whatever you were doing. I was treating a physician with borderline personality disorder who would have all of these intrusive negative thoughts while he was making rounds at the hospital.
Yeah.
He'd yell himself, I'm a lousy doctor, and I probably forgot to do blah, blah, blah on my last patient, and I'll probably get sued. And he was just constantly distracting himself. So I told him to bring a tape recorder with him when he was making rounds. And then as he walked from hospital room to hospital room, he would dictate these intentionally into the tape recorder.
Yeah.
Like a cell phone type of deal, and then go and examine the patient, ignore the negative thoughts, and then dictate them again. And then at the end of his rounds, to sit down in his office and turn on the tape recorder and force himself to listen to all of this self-critical dialogue. And after 2 or 3 days of doing this, it began to seem ridiculous to him. And then all of this self-criticism diminished and disappeared on when he was making rounds.
That's interesting, because I've used the technique with some of my clients.
Oh,
but
you have?
I didn't ask them to listen to their critical thoughts or intrusive thoughts.
Yeah,
and it worked for them. But maybe I should also try sometimes to ask them to listen to them.
Well, you made an important point, because these techniques are not techniques; they're metaphors for how to help people.
Yeah.
And once you grasp the concept, you can do them in a zillion different ways.
Right.
And you can individualize it and be very, very creative.
So next one is humor-based techniques, and number 17 is the paradoxical magnification.
Yes, the paradoxical magnification was helpful for my daughter when she was preparing for her Aikido exam. She had the idea, I'm going to screw up her black belt in Aikido. She was very devoted to Aikido, which is one of the martial arts. And she kept thinking she'll make a fool of herself in front of everybody and blah, blah, blah. And I tried a lot of techniques that didn't work. And the one that really worked for her was paradoxical magnification. I suggested that she just imagine all the things that could go wrong during her Aikido exam and just make it as horrible as possible. So she imagined getting out of there, and she falls over, and then she starts farting out loud, and then everybody starts scorning her and pointing at her. And we made it really, really terrible. And then I told her to fantasize it, and she just burst into laughter, and it just broke the anxiety. And then she went just to have fun with her Aikido exam.
Yeah, it's great.
So there's again a zillion kind of humorous ways you can magnify things. The one time you don't want to use a humor-based technique is with a patient who's angry. And then they'll think you're making fun of their anger, and it's definitely a bad idea. Yeah. I use a tremendous amount of humor in therapy.
I know you do, and there's kind of like a skill to it that's almost impossible to teach. It's more about you have to feel it.
Yeah, right.
Number 18 is shame attacking exercises.
Now, this is one of the best techniques on the planet Earth. Like any technique, it can be screwed up.
You enjoy torturing your students with this one.
Well, myself, too. I practice what I preach. But a lot of times, anxious patients, I would say all anxious patients are afraid of making a fool of themselves in public. And they think that people will look down on them, and they're always trying to be so stiff and proper, which actually kind of turns people off. And so you can have the patient do something bizarre in public on purpose to make a fool of themselves, to see that the world doesn't come to an end. A very humble one. I was working with an attractive young woman who was an options trader in Philadelphia, in this world mainly dominated by men. And but she wanted to date, but she was very shy and was afraid of making a fool of herself. So I told her to go into the local Wanamaker's department store near the options trading, wherever they did it in downtown Philadelphia, and go in, find a real crowded area, and then shout out real loud, the time is 4:38 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I remember you talked about it.
Yeah. And she didn't want to do it. And, she thought this is going to be terrible. And so she did it. She went in, she shouted it out. There were all these women buying stockings. There was some big stocking sale. And they just totally ignored her. And then I told her then shouted out again, and she shouted it out again, and they continued to ignore her, and it broke her anxiety, and then she was able to start going to singles bars and flirting with cute guys, and soon she had a very rich dating life. I've done a lot of shame attacking exercises myself, and pretty soon you and I are going to go out with the Tuesday group on a Tuesday evening.
As soon as we get our microphones to work.
Yeah. We've got some new microphones, and then we're going to get all the therapists going out doing shame attacking exercises.
Yeah. So now we're on to role-playing techniques, and by the way, we just did a series of episodes on those role-playing techniques, so people can also refer back to this.
Yeah, and we just did externalization of voices, so
yes.
We don't need to repeat that one.
That's right. So, and people can go to episode 83, which was when we demonstrated it. So number 20 is the feared fantasy technique, which we demonstrated in episodes 86 and 88.
Yeah.
But you can talk about that briefly.
Yeah, in the feared fantasy, you go into an Alice in Wonderland nightmare world where your worst fears come true, and you meet a monster who criticizes you in all the ways that you think real people might be thinking about you, but wouldn't say it verbally. And so, for example, if you go to the podcast, the second Feared Fantasy podcast, Alicia was thinking that people would be imagining that because she blushes, she's stupid and untrained and that type of thing. Now, people would never say those things to her, so the only way she can confront the monster is to act it out in this feared fantasy world that has two rules. If you think people are having negative thoughts about you, they really are. In addition, they don't just think them, they get right up in your face and say them.
Yeah.
And this gives you a chance to discover that the monster has no teeth. Let's quickly do it so they know what we're talking about. I'll be, you want to be Alicia?
I'll be Alicia.
And I'll be the group member from hell. And remember, this is imaginary. And say, could I talk to you for a minute, Alicia?
Sure.
I noticed that you blush a lot in group, and I just wanted to tell you that I've concluded from that you probably don't know what you're doing.
Well, you don't know me at all. It's true, I'm blushing, but that means zero.
I see. Well, I don't care. I reject you.
Good. I don't care to be accepted by you.
So that's how it goes, and you can do a lot of role reversals back and forth, and model all different kinds of ways to defeat these thoughts.
Yeah.
And the next one is the acceptance paradox,
which is under philosophical/spiritual techniques.
Right, and I'll show you another way to defeat the thought that I just hit you with.
Yeah.
Using the acceptance paradox. You use self-defense.
That's right, I did, yes.
And the problem with self-defense is, from a Buddhist perspective, self-defense causes warfare. And the person you're at war at is yourself.
Yep.
And once you start defending yourself, you'll get into a battle you may never be able to win. So I'll show you another way to befriend the feared fantasy monster. Go ahead. We'll do a role reversal.
So I'll be the negative voice, the monster. Well, you must be stupid. Look, you're just blushing.
Well, once you get to know me, that's one of my lesser flaws, actually. I blush.
So you acknowledge you have this flaw?
Well, no, I would have to acknowledge I have tons of flaws. That's just one of a long list, and sometimes I am.
That's what I thought.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I have. There's a lot of things I don't know. Is there something you noticed that I did or said in group that seems stupid?
Well, everything you say, you blush when you say it.
Oh, I see.
It must be stupid.
Yeah, does that upset you? Have you ever been around other people who blushed?
Yeah, but you're such a blusher.
I got an award for it recently. And
I noticed that there's some humor in it too.
Yeah.
And this is something that you inject quite a bit.
But the one I had asked you to attack me with, you went back to the earlier ones, was I reject you. Remember?
Oh yeah.
That's the one you got real defensive on.
Right.
Do a role reversal.
I reject you.
No kidding. That's too bad, because I've kind of enjoyed you, and I've learned a lot from you here in the group. Do you reject everyone with flaws, or everyone who blushes or gets anxious?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, as a therapist, you must have a terrible time with your patients. Do you reject all of them as well?
Yeah.
So who won?
Oh, you did. You did.
So that's the acceptance paradox. For some thoughts, self-defense works best. For some thoughts, the acceptance paradox is far more powerful. And for some thoughts, a combination is the most effective. Mm-hmm. On to visual imaging techniques.
Yeah, you don't demonstrate these very often, so I'm quite interested to hear what you have to say about this. The number 22 is called time projection.
Yeah, it's actually not one that I use a lot, but you can have patients close their eyes, and then you can call it hypnosis or just visual imaging, and take a trip into the past. Say they've had a traumatic event, and go back and visualize that event and allow themselves to get as upset as possible. It's also called cognitive flooding, and just stick with the image and the anxiety until the anxiety dissipates and disappears. A lot of times when people have had past traumatic events, when they get a memory of the event, like being raped or like one of my patients, when he grew up, his father said, "You've always got to go to the Scouts and go to all the camping trips." And when he'd go on the camping trips, the scoutmaster and older scouts would take him out into the woods and rape him. And
it's terrible.
It was horrible for him. And he didn't have any friends, and his parents were divorced, and he lived with his father, and his father was a hardcore alcoholic, was drunk all the time. And so he never got any support. He would, when he would have a mental image of this, then he would try to push it out of his mind. And that's what keeps it alive. You can also use a technique, which is called memory rescripting. And I think it's we'll come to a little later. But you can also have the patient go into the past and then change the image, just like a movie editor, change the scene in the movie. For example, we could have him enter the scene as a big, powerful adult and punish that scoutmaster and have them arrested, or talk to the scoutmaster and the older scouts and say the things that he never could have said as a little boy, or talk to the father who abused you when you were little and say, "Dad, I loved you and I needed your support, and when you took me out in the shed and whipped me all the time with your belt, it crushed my spirit, and I was always afraid to tell you for fear that I'd get whipped again." And just
you can travel in time and really change things so that, one thing is that we know now about memory is that memory is changeable and it's not fixed like in a computer.
That's a good point.
When you retrieve it, you can massage it and it goes back in a slightly altered way.
Yeah.
So number 23 is humorous imaging.
This is another, you could call it a humor-based technique. You can change an anxiety-provoking image into a humorous image, as we talked about with paradoxical magnification. You can also just create a humorous image. I was treating a pretty attractive but extremely uptight, a little bit paranoid professional woman in Philadelphia. And she wasn't dating. She had extreme social anxiety, and she said in the hotel or the apartment where she lived, this real cute guy would often end up on the same elevator. I guess they had similar schedules, but she would never talk to him because she was afraid of making a fool of herself, or like shy people, or just
sure.
So what helped her is I told her that when she talked to him, he was an attorney, to imagine that he was arguing a case in court with wearing only his underpants. and this struck her as very funny.
Right.
And
It's kind of reminiscent of this suggestion they give to public speakers that to imagine that their audience is naked.
Oh, I say I didn't hear that one.
Oh, you never heard that? Yeah,
that's a good one too. And so. And I said also give him some kind of a compliment, even if it's kind of lame, like men like compliments, particularly from attractive lady. And so the next morning he was right there in the elevator and she pictured him in car and said, "Oh, that's a cute tie you're wearing," started laughing. And so he said, "Well, what are you laughing about?" She said, I don't know. There's just something about you that makes me feel really happy." And then he says, "Well, I've been kind of noticing you too. Why don't we get together for coffee after work?" And then they started dating. Yeah. So I wouldn't call it a heavyweight technique by a long shot. It's a little gimmicky. But it's been helpful for a number of people over the years. Yeah.
Number 24 is cognitive hypnosis.
Yeah, if you like hypnosis, one of my former students and now dear colleagues, Matt May, is very hypnotizable, and he loves to hypnotize people, and did it a lot as a teenager, and I did too. Mm-hmm. We both kind of like hypnosis, and so if you like, you can actually hypnotize your patients, and you can do any of the cognitive therapy techniques or the team therapy techniques or any form of psychotherapy when the patient is in a hypnotic state.
Right.
And it's kind of like they're just much more suggestible, and then you have all the bells and whistles of hypnosis. You can project them into the past, into the future. You can have them image traumatic events on a movie screen and tell them that they have a controller in their hand, like a television controller. So if the traumatic event becomes too upsetting, they can just change the channel. I would say there's probably 35 hypnotic techniques you can use that can be helpful for people with depression and anxiety disorders. However, hypnosis itself is not a treatment for anything. It is not per se therapeutic. It's just getting people into a relaxed, suggestible state. And then it's the therapy that you do with them in that relaxed, suggestible state that can be very, right. very potent. I was telling my one of the residents from Stanford that I'm supervising about once that, just to disguise things, a colleague and I hypnotized a young woman who had been having years of failed therapy for hypochondriasis. She kept going to the doctor thinking, she had a spinal tumor or this or that. And often that's this hidden emotion problem. Yeah, there's something she's not owning up to.
They're somatizing,
Yeah. And so we hypnotized her together and told her that she would see a movie screen. She was in her backyard, and the part of the fence would turn into a movie screen. And then she said, "Oh, I can see it. It's totally like a real movie screen." And then said, "Now you're going to see something that you haven't been dealing with. That's the key to your problem the last 8 years." And then when you see it on the movie screen, you just wiggle your finger. And she was like 5 seconds, and her finger went up. Said, "Now you're going to be able to tell us, you won't wake up, you'll still be hypnotized, but you can tell us what you see." And she said, "Oh, I'm seeing myself as an old lady." And she was getting tearful and said, "Well, why are you upset?" And she said, "Well, because I missed the boat in my life. I married the wrong man." Mm. And then said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, my boyfriend isn't that good with sex, and I've just been too shy to tell him." And then we told her she could wake up and she could remember what she told us or not, and it was her choice. But then, when she woke up, she was willing to talk about it. Then we gave her the assignment to talk it over with him, and to tell him what she liked and what she disliked, and And she was very courageous because, like most anxious patients, she was overly nice and afraid of, being assertive or always brushing her feelings under the rock or whatever, under the rug. And then she came in the next week in a state of just euphoria. She'd had the most wonderful conversation with her boyfriend. The sex got much better, and they had actually gotten engaged.
All right.
But it was just a little use of cognitive hypnosis.
All right. I think that we'll leave the rest for the next episode. I don't want to go on for too long. I think we covered quite some territory, and I invite our listeners to join us next week for the remainder of the 50 methods in not really 50 minutes, but
metaphorically 50
metaphorically.
Minutes.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Fabrice.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.